In the heart of a city that never slept, where neon lights flickered against the darkened sky and the streets buzzed with life, a storm was brewing beneath the surface. This was a city teetering on the edge of chaos, plagued by a rising tide of crime, fueled by an enigmatic organization known as the Nexus. Among its many victims was Gene, a young man gifted and cursed with extraordinary speed. Gene had once been a promising athlete, his feet seemingly gliding across the track, a blur to the untrained eye. But everything changed the night of the accident. A lab experiment, an unexpected surge of energy, and suddenly he could move faster than the eye could see. The speed was intoxicating, a high that came with devastating consequences. Each burst of velocity left him with a searing pain that shot through his limbs, a brutal reminder of the limits of his gift. Despite the excruciating cost, he had learned to embrace his abilities, though he often questioned the price that on an ordinary evening. Gene sat on the edge of his bed, fingers idly tapping against his phone, lost in thoughts of the past and the burdens of the present. His sister, Lien, filled his mind, a bright, curious girl who had always looked up to him. She was his anchor, the one person who could pull him back from the edge of his reckless speed. That evening, her voice crackled through the phone, sharp and frantic. "Gene. They've taken me. The Nexus, they know about you. I'm at." The call abruptly ended, leaving only silence in its wake. Jin's heart raced, panic flooding his system. He knew the dangers of the Nexus all too well. They were ruthless, a shadowy cabal that thrived on fear and control. Without hesitation, he threw on a jacket and bolted out of his apartment, adrenaline surging through him. With a single thought, he unleashed his power, feeling the familiar rush as he propelled himself through the streets. Buildings blurred past him, pedestrians became mere phantoms in his wake, their shouts dissolving into the wind. He had never pushed himself this hard before, but Lien was in danger, and he would do whatever it took to save her. The night was a blur of speed and desperation, each moment a test of his limits. He darted between cars, leaped over obstacles, and rounded corners with precision that bordered on supernatural. Yet, with each burst of speed, pain lanced through his muscles, warning him that he was stretching the boundaries of his body far too thin. But he pushed on, driven by fear and love, the two forces intertwining into a singular purpose. Arriving at the last known location Lien had mentioned, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Gene skidded to a stop. He crouched behind a rusted container, scanning the area. Shadows moved, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw them, the dark figures of the Nexus, armed and menacing. He needed a plan, but his thoughts raced as quickly as his body did. He caught sight of an old security camera, its lens gleaming under the moonlight. Gene moved closer, instinctively using his speed to scale the warehouse wall and peer inside. Through the grimy glass, he spotted Lien, bound and frightened, surrounded by thugs who were plotting their next move. The sight ignited something primal within him. He had to act, and he had to do it fast. Steeling himself, he prepared to breach the building, the pain in his limbs momentarily forgotten in the face of impending doom. He unleashed his speed, bursting through the door with a force that caught the thugs off guard. "Get away from her!" Gene shouted, the intensity of his voice filling the warehouse. The surprise turned to chaos as he darted among them, a whirlwind of fists and feet. Each strike felt like fire racing through his body, but he didn't falter. He was fighting for Lien. In the frenzy, he caught a glimpse of Victor, the ruthless leader of the Nexus, lurking in the shadows. A man with cold eyes and a chilling smile, Victor was the puppeteer of this operation. The realization fueled Jin's resolve. If he could take down Victor, he might end the Nexus's reign of terror once and for all. But as he took down another thug, pain shot through his side, a reminder of the toll his powers were taking. He staggered for a moment, and Victor seized the opportunity to confront him directly. "Ah, the infamous Speedster," Victor taunted, his voice smooth as silk. "You think you can save her? You're merely a tool, and tools can be broken." Jin's eyes blazed with defiance, even as his body screamed for respite. "I'm not just a tool. I'm her brother. And I will not let you take her from me." The tension in the room crackled like electricity. With a roar, Jin surged forward, using every ounce of strength left within him. He charged at Victor, but the pain escalated, blurring his vision. He reached for Victor, but everything turned to darkness as he fell to the floor, the world fading around him. When he regained consciousness, he was in a dimly lit room, a sterile hospital smell wafting through the air. Confused and disoriented, he tried to move but was met with searing pain. Lien sat beside him, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "Jin. You're awake," she exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What happened?" he croaked, his voice raspy. "You collapsed after confronting Victor." "I thought I'd lost you," Lien whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Jin closed his eyes, memories flooding back. He had failed. The Nexus was still out there, and Victor remained a threat. But the battle was not over. They had uncovered enough information to fight back, to take the fight to the Nexus. With Lien's presence grounding him, he felt a surge of determination. This time, he wouldn't just rely on his speed. He would need strategy, allies, and perhaps a new understanding of his limits. After days of recovery, Jin found himself back on the streets, the city pulsing with life. He sought out Maya, a brilliant hacker and a close friend, who had helped him gather intel before. They met in a small cafe, the smell of coffee mingling with the ambient noise of chatter. "Maya, I need your help," Jin began, his voice low and urgent. "The Nexus is planning something big, and I have to stop them." Maya looked up, concern etched across her face. "You're in no shape to fight, Jin. You need to take it easy." "I can't. They have Lien, and they're dangerous." "I have to push myself," he insisted, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. With a sigh, Maya agreed to help. "Fine, but we need a plan. We can't just rush in blindly this time." Over the next few days, they gathered information, carefully mapping out the Nexus's operations. Each time Jin pushed himself to train, he felt the familiar ache in his body but also the growing sense of purpose. They discovered that the Nexus was working on a new mind control weapon, a technology that could enslave thousands. With this knowledge, they formulated a plan to infiltrate the main facility. Jin would use his speed to breach security, while Maya would hack into their systems and disable the weapon. It was a risky endeavor, but they had no other choice. On the night of the operation, Jin's heart raced with anticipation. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as they approached the facility, its imposing structure looming like a fortress. He turned to Maya, determination etched on his face. No turning back now. They slipped inside, and the world outside faded away as they navigated the labyrinth of hallways. Jin moved swiftly, evading guards and sensors, his speed becoming second nature. But with every burst of energy, the pain in his body amplified, echoing in his bones. He had to ignore it. Lien was counting on him. Finally, they reached the main control room. Maya got to work, fingers dancing over the keyboard as she hacked into the system. Jin stood guard, his senses heightened, ready for anything. But just as they thought they were in the clear, alarms blared, and the door slammed shut behind them. "Jin!" Maya cried, panic lacing her voice. "We're trapped." He felt the surge of urgency as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The Nexus had found them. We need to get out, now. Gene focused, pushing through the pain as he prepared to burst into action. I'll create a distraction. You keep working. With that, he sprinted toward the door, a blur of motion as he charged at the guards rushing in. They were no match for his speed, and he took them down one by one, but each strike left him gasping for breath, the toll on his body becoming unbearable. As he fought, the door behind him swung open, revealing Maya. I'm in. I just need a minute, she shouted, urgency in her voice, but time was slipping away. The guards were regrouping, and Gene felt the walls closing in on him. He knew he had to make a choice, push himself further and risk everything, or retreat and lose Lien forever. In that moment, he remembered Lien's face, the fear in her eyes, and the love that bound them. He couldn't turn back. With one last surge of energy, he raced toward the guards, moving faster than he ever had before. He felt a rush of exhilaration mingling with pain, his body protesting with every movement, but he embraced it, channeling his fury and determination. He spun, dodging their attacks, striking with precision, until finally, they were down. But as the last guard fell, darkness edged into his vision, and he stumbled. Maya's voice cut through the haze, Gene, now. He turned, forcing himself to focus. Maya was finishing her work, the countdown ticking down ominously. With the last of his strength, Gene sprinted to her side, done. Let's go, she shouted, grabbing his arm. They raced down the hall just as the facility began to explode around them, the sound of chaos enveloping them. Gene felt the heat on his back, but they were moving toward freedom. Bursting through the exit, they barely made it outside as the building detonated in a fiery eruption, debris raining down around them. Gene collapsed on the ground, breathing heavily, the adrenaline fading. They had done it, they had thwarted the Nexus's plan, at least for now. As sirens wailed in the distance, Gene looked over at Maya. We did it, he said, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. Yeah, but it's not over yet, she replied, scanning the horizon. Victor will come after us. Let him, Gene said, determination blazing in his eyes. I'll be ready. For Lien. For everyone. With that, he pushed himself to his feet, the pain still there but overshadowed by the resolve to keep fighting. Together, they would face whatever came next. Gene steadied himself, pushing through the exhaustion that threatened to engulf him. The night air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and the distant sound of sirens grew louder, reminding him of the urgency still at hand. He glanced at Maya, who was frantically scanning the surroundings, her brow furrowed in concern. We need to move. They'll send reinforcements soon, she urged, her voice steadied despite the chaos. Nodding, Gene took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. They had disrupted the Nexus's plans, but Victor wouldn't take that defeat lightly. As they ducked into the nearest alley, the shadows swallowed them whole, providing a temporary refuge. The adrenaline was still coursing through Jin's veins, but the toll on his body was becoming increasingly apparent. Every muscle screamed in protest as they moved further from the explosion. Where to now? Maya whispered, peering around the corner. We need to find somewhere safe to regroup, Gene replied, wincing as he pressed a hand against his side, where pain throbbed like a heartbeat. Somewhere we can lay low and come up with a plan. They moved quickly, sticking to the back streets, relying on the dim light of flickering street lamps to guide them. They eventually found a rundown diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Gene pushed the door open, and the familiar smell of coffee and grease wafted over them, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Inside, the diner was mostly empty, save for a few late-night patrons nursing cups of coffee and their own secrets. Jean chose a booth in the back corner, where they could keep an eye on the entrance while remaining hidden. They slid into the booth, and for a moment, silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city outside. "What now?" Maya asked, pulling out her laptop and connecting to the diner's weak Wi-Fi signal. "We need to find out what Victor has planned next," Jean said, rubbing his temples as he tried to gather his thoughts. "If he comes after us, we need to be ready." Maya's fingers flew over the keyboard, her focus intense. "I'll see what I can dig up. They'll likely be scrambling to recover from tonight's chaos, but if I can get into their systems, we might find something useful." As she worked, Jean couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Victor would not rest until he had exacted his revenge, and Jean knew he had made a powerful enemy. He had seen the way Victor operated. He thrived on fear and manipulation. It was a game of chess, and Jean was determined to outmaneuver him. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the diner slowly filled with more patrons. Jean sipped his coffee, forcing himself to stay alert, while Maya continued her work, the glow of the screen illuminating her concentrated face. Finally, a triumphant smile broke across her lips. "Got it. They've got a safe house not far from here, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Looks like they're regrouping there." Jean leaned in, his heart racing. "Do you think they're planning to move against us?" "Possibly. If they're bringing in more manpower, they might be preparing for a counterstrike." "We need to get there before they do," Maya said, her tone serious, with a renewed sense of purpose. They finished their coffee and slipped out of the diner, careful not to attract attention. The streets felt different now, charged with a sense of impending confrontation. Jin's mind raced as they made their way toward the warehouse, each step echoing with the weight of their mission. As they approached the location, Jin felt the familiar thrum of energy build within him. He glanced at Maya. "Stay close. If things get out of hand, I need you to get out. I won't let anything happen to you." "Don't worry about me," she replied, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Just focus on saving Lien and stopping Victor." The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but Jean could see faint lights flickering inside. They moved stealthily, slipping through a gap in the side wall. The interior was a maze of crates and equipment, remnants of past operations. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air was thick with tension. Jean took a deep breath, channeling his energy as they crept further inside. They needed to gather information, find Lien, and confront Victor, but the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. He focused on the sounds around him, muffled voices, the occasional clatter of metal, and the distant hum of machinery. As they rounded a corner, they caught sight of a group of men gathered around a table, maps and blueprints sprawled out before them. Jin's heart raced. This was it, the nerve center of the Nexus. "Maya, can you get close enough to listen in?" he whispered. "Yeah, but it'll be tricky," she replied, eyes scanning the area for a better vantage point. They found a stack of crates that provided some cover. Maya climbed up quietly, positioning herself to overhear the conversation. Jean crouched low, focusing on the men, their voices becoming clearer. "Victor wants the new weapon operational by tomorrow," one man said, his voice gruff. "If we can control the city's infrastructure, we'll have total power." Another chimed in, "But what about the Speedster? He won't stop coming after us." "The kid is a liability," the first man snapped. "We need to deal with him before he disrupts our plans again." Jin's blood ran cold. They were discussing him, and the implications were clear. They intended to eliminate him before he could make another move. But the mention of the weapon struck a chord deep within him. He couldn't let it be unleashed. Maya, still perched on the crates, focused on her laptop. I'm scanning for any security systems. If I can access their network, we can sabotage the weapon, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Do it, Jean urged, watching the men as they continued their discussion. They were outlining an attack on the city, a plan that could lead to widespread chaos. Just then, one of the men looked up, scanning the area as if sensing something was off. Jin's heart raced as he gestured for Maya to hurry. They couldn't be discovered now. He felt the weight of time pressing down on him. Maya, he hissed, urgency lacing his tone, I'm in. Give me a second, she whispered back, fingers flying across the keyboard. Jin's heart thudded as he watched the men, the tension in the air thickening. If they didn't move soon, everything they had worked for would be lost. Suddenly, Maya gasped. Jean, they're activating the weapon now. We need to stop them. Let's go. Jean shouted, adrenaline surging as he bolted from their hiding spot, moving faster than the eye could see. The men barely had time to react before Jean was upon them, fists flying. He fought with a ferocity born from desperation, taking down the nearest thug before they realized what was happening. But even as he fought, pain shot through his body. Each movement felt like a battle against his own limits, but he couldn't afford to back down. Maya quickly followed, her laptop in hand. I'll try to disable it from here, she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos of the fight. Jean continued to fight, a whirlwind of speed and determination, but he felt the weight of his body beginning to drag him down. Each punch landed was followed by an overwhelming wave of pain. He was pushing himself beyond reason, and it was starting to take its toll. Just as he thought he was gaining the upper hand, a familiar voice sliced through the noise. You think you can stop me, Jean? Jean turned to see Victor standing at the far end of the warehouse, a calm smile on his face, even as chaos erupted around him. You should have stayed out of this. Jean felt a surge of anger at the sight of Victor. You won't get away with this. Victor chuckled, his voice dripping with disdain. You have no idea what you're up against. My plans are already in motion. You're just a boy playing hero. I'll stop you, Jean vowed, pushing through the pain and charging at Victor. But as he moved, Victor gestured, and a group of armed guards stepped forward, blocking Jin's path. Jean fought hard, but fatigue was creeping in, slowing his movements. He had to find a way to turn the tide. As he fought, he could see Maya in the corner of his eye, frantically trying to bypass security protocols. Just a few more seconds, she yelled, her voice strained with focus. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jean redirected his energy, darting among the guards with a precision born from desperation. He ducked and weaved, using the environment to his advantage, but he felt each clash take a toll on his body. It was a race against time, and he was painfully aware that he couldn't keep this up forever. Finally, he managed to break through the guards, racing toward Victor. This ends now, he shouted, his voice fierce, but Victor smiled, unperturbed. You think you can take me on alone? You underestimate the power of the Nexus. With a flick of his wrist, he activated a nearby control panel, and the room filled with blaring alarms. Jean hesitated for a split second, realizing what Victor was doing. Maya! Get out of here, he shouted, but she was already working frantically, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she fought to disable the weapon. Victor laughed, the sound echoing in the chaos. You're too late. This city will belong to us. With a surge of desperation, Jean lunged at Victor, but just as he reached him, the floor beneath them trembled, and a violent explosion rocked the warehouse. Jean was thrown backward, crashing against a stack of crates. The world spun as he fought to regain his footing. "Maya," he shouted, scrambling to his feet, pain radiating through his body. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring his vision. He could hear the panicked shouts of the guards as they struggled to regain control. "I'm almost there." Maya's voice cut through the noise, but it was laced with urgency and fear. Jean forced himself to move, pushing through the debris, searching for her. The air was thick with smoke, and he could barely see. He reached the control panel where Maya was working, her face a mask of concentration. "Just a little longer," she urged, but the sound of footsteps grew closer, and Jean knew they had to hurry. With a final, desperate effort, he surged forward, taking down the last of the guards standing in their way. But as he did, Victor slipped through the chaos, a smirk on his face as he made his escape. "Maya, we have to go," Jean shouted, grabbing her arm as she finished her work. "I did it." "The weapon is disabled," she exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. But before they could celebrate, the warehouse shook again, and more guards rushed in from the shadows, weapons drawn. "Jean, we can't fight them all," Maya cried, fear flashing in her eyes. With no time to lose, Jean turned toward the exit. "We'll make it. Just follow my lead." They raced toward the exit, dodging incoming fire as they sprinted through the collapsing structure. Jean felt the heat behind him, the flames licking at his heels. They burst through the exit just as the warehouse began to implode, the force of the explosion propelling them forward. They hit the ground hard, rolling to safety as the building crumbled behind them. Breathing heavily, Jean looked over at Maya, who was equally shaken but unharmed. "We made it," he said, relief flooding his voice. "Barely," she replied, her eyes wide as she took in the destruction. "But what now?" "Victor won't stop coming after us." "We need to warn others," Jean replied, determination igniting within him. "We've delayed their plans, but we can't let them regroup. We have to strike back, take the fight to them." Maya nodded, her expression shifting from fear to resolve. "You're right. We can't let them gain any more power." They got to their feet, dusting themselves off as the distant sound of sirens approached. "We have to move," Jean urged, scanning the area for any sign of danger. "Let's find somewhere safe to regroup and plan our next move." They started down the alley, their minds racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Jean knew they would need allies, information, and a strategy. But as they disappeared into the shadows, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Together, they would stand against the Nexus, no matter the cost. As they navigated the winding streets of the city, they came across a small community center, its lights flickering in the distance. It was a familiar place, one that had once served as a safe haven for many in the neighborhood. They slipped inside, the door creaking quietly behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, and a few locals were gathered, chatting and laughing. It felt like a world apart from the chaos outside, and for a moment, Jean allowed himself to breathe. He knew they had to act quickly, but the sense of normalcy was a comforting balm against the turmoil in his heart. "Do you know where we can find anyone who can help us?" Maya asked, scanning the room. Jean nodded. "There's an old contact of mine who used to work with some community leaders. If anyone can rally support against the Nexus, it's him." They moved through the community center, finding a corner where an older man sat, his weathered face etched with lines of wisdom and experience. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Jean? Is that you?" he asked, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Mr. Chen," Jean replied, a wave of nostalgia hitting him. "We need your help. The Nexus is planning something big, and they're not going to stop until they've taken control of this city." Mr. Chen's brow furrowed with worry. "I've heard whispers of their activities. It's dangerous to confront them directly." "I know," Jean said, determination in his voice. "But if we don't act, they'll hurt more people. We need to unite those who are willing to fight back." After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Chen nodded. "All right. I'll help you. We can gather some of the old crew and make a plan. We may not have the resources they do, but we have the heart of this community." As Mr. Chen began making calls, Jean felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. It was a small step, but it was a start. He turned to Maya, who was watching with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked, his voice low. "I've been ready," she replied, her eyes fierce. "We've come this far. There's no turning back now." As the community center buzzed with activity, Jean felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were fighting for more than just themselves. They were fighting for a city that had been caught in the crossfire of a dangerous game. And with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher. By the time they had gathered a small group, a mix of old friends and new faces, Jean felt a sense of solidarity that had been missing in his life for too long. They all shared a common goal: to reclaim their city from the Nexus. As they discussed their plans, Jean found himself at the center of the group, their eyes fixed on him, expectant. "We need to be smart about this," he began, his voice steady. "Victor won't underestimate us again. We need to hit them where it hurts." The group nodded, the atmosphere shifting from fear to resolve. They talked late into the night, strategizing and gathering resources. Jean felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was not just about his family anymore, it was about protecting a community that had always stood together in the face of adversity. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Jean stood with Maya by his side, looking out over the city that had been both a battleground and a home. He knew the fight ahead would be dangerous, but he felt ready to face whatever came next. "Are you sure about this?" Maya asked, glancing up at him. "I have to be," he replied, determination in his eyes. "For Lien, for all of us." With the dawn breaking, they stepped into the light, ready to face their fate. They would confront Victor and the Nexus, and they would fight for their city with everything they had. As they moved forward, Jean felt a sense of unity and strength swell within him. They were not alone, they were a force to be reckoned with. The path ahead was uncertain, but together, they would forge their destiny. And no matter the outcome, Jean was ready to embrace the fight. As they set their plan into motion, the city thrummed with life around them, oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. But for Jean and his allies, the battle was just beginning, and they were determined to stand against the darkness, to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, and to ensure that the Nexus would never threaten their world again. They had ignited a spark, and together, they would turn it into a fire.